Hello again, everyone, and welcome to Well-Hung History, true crime, true history, and the true tales of the condemned and the executed. I'm Terry Allen, and thanks for joining us. Today we'll discuss a man that thankfully is mostly forgotten, and that is the unrepentant fascist and founder of the American Nazi Party, George Lincoln Rockwell. Now, before we get into the meat and potatoes of what makes Rockwell notorious and infamous, we'll cover some basics of his birth and upbringing. He was born March 19th, 1918, in Bloomington, Illinois, to George Lovejoy Rockwell and Claire, her maiden name was Shade Rockwell. He was the first of three siblings. His father was of British lineage, and his mother's ancestors were immigrants to the United States from Germany and Quebec. They were both vaudeville performers, and as such, the family traveled extensively, living a sort of nomadic existence during George Jr.'s early years. But they soon divorced, and he split his high school years between his father's home in Boothbay Harbor, Maine, and his mother's residence in Atlantic City, New Jersey. He went on to attend Hebron Academy in Maine before enrolling at Brown University in 1938, but he dropped out during his sophomore year. Hebron Academy is a place that I'm oddly acquainted with, as I played on the rival JV basketball squad of the Gould Academy Huskies in nearby Bethel, Maine. If I have it right, I think I might have scored 5 points on that day when we played our rivals, but maybe I'm wrong, as one of my free throws probably missed. He then enlisted in the U.S. Navy, where he served honorably in the Pacific Theater as well as the Battle of the Atlantic, so he's fighting on both sides. And it was in this protracted latter battle that he ironically would fight against the forces of Adolf Hitler, whom he would come to esteem and emulate as his great hero. During the war years, he married Judith Altman, a former classmate from Brown, and with her sired 3 girls, Bonnie, Nancy, and Phoebe. But this union was not a happy one, and Rockwell was prone to violence and domestic abuse, so it didn't last very long. But the family, still together, technically, returned to Boothbay following the war, and he alternately worked at his father's sign painting shop there, as well as dabbling in commercial art and advertising in New York City. In 1950, the family relocated to San Diego, where he was recalled to military duty as a lieutenant commander at the outset of the Korean War. It was during this period, now in his mid-30s, that he began to ensconce himself in various hard-right causes and openly express admiration for the anti-communist crusade of Senator Joseph McCarthy. He also begins to espouse the openly anti-Semitic writings and ramblings of Henry Ford, Charles Lindbergh, and other known fanboys of the Führer. And his bedtime reading was known to have included the likes of Mein Kampf and the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Just a little light reading before the lights went out. 2 years after having been transferred to San Diego, Rockwell was transferred to the Aryan paradise of Iceland, which he must have adored. Well, his wife, back with the kids in sunny San Diego, seems to have welcomed this transfer, and she filed for divorce. Learning of this, it doesn't take him long to remarry, and he does just that the next year, and this time to Margaret Pora Hallgrímsson. Any Icelanders out there that want to set me straight on that pronunciation? The daughter of Iceland's ambassador to the United States. And where do they go on their honeymoon? No, not Vegas, not St. Lucia, not Venice or Paris. You got it. They head for a romantic romp in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian Alps, a village near one of Hitler's favorite bunkers, Alderhorst, designed by none other than the Nazi architect Albrecht Speer. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. George and Margaret return to the U.S., and together they have 3 more children. But as you might not be surprised to learn, this marriage also failed quite quickly. It seems that the ambassador father-in-law learned through diplomatic channels that his daughter had married, quote, one of the most active racists in the United States. So she and the kids were soon on the next flight to Reykjavik. Now a 40-year-old bachelor and dabbling in a series of mostly unsuccessful pursuits at advertising and publishing, he decides to make his life's work the promotion of fascism in the United States. And his initial foray into the fascist fringe, along with another Jew-baiter named Harold Arrowsmith, is the formation of a group called, quote, the National Committee to Free America from Jewish Domination. So now we not only have an Arrowsmith, we have a wordsmith, and within a year, the group changes its name to another zinger. This time, quote, the World Union of Free Enterprise National Socialists. What? Free Enterprise Socialists? It makes no sense. All right, but for some crazy reason, this one doesn't stick either. So he and his handful of would-be stormtroopers finally cut to the chase and make it country simple. They would now be known as, quote, the American Nazi Party, and they set up their own bunker at Rockwell's home in Arlington, Virginia. In 1960, just 1 year shy of his military retirement, he was kicked out of the Navy on the grounds of being, quote, not deployable. Well, I guess that seems in order, but how about just, quote, not employable, or even, quote, not enjoyable? In response to this discharge, he and his minions hold a rally, more of a gathering, really, on the National Mall in Washington in Nazi-style regalia festooned with both swastikas and the stars and stripes. And a footnote here, the uniforms look very similar to those worn by the pro-Nazi German-American Bund that had attracted disturbingly high membership during the war years. Further rallies were planned over the coming months in New York and again in Washington, but they were quashed by a combination of violent clashes with anti-protesters and legal injunctions. At one of these would-be events, Rockwell and some of his supporters were arrested, and rather than face trial, he was sent away to a mental asylum where our paranoid poet pens a pamphlet entitled, quote, How to Get Out or Stay Out of the Insane Asylum. And to all you blues fans out there, I would encourage you, just for fun, to listen to the great song called Insane Asylum by Willie Dixon and Koko Taylor. Once out of the funny farm, he and his goons staged more protests and disturbances, including one in Boston, which was met with as many as 2,000 counter-protesters. But maybe he's not such a bad marketer after all, as these publicity stunts gain him a small but growing following and plenty of press. Now he's ready to really make his mark, and so he decides to swing for the fences and run for President of the United States in 1964 under the American Nazi Party banner. And he receives, drum roll, we need a big drum roll here, 212 of the 70,651,531 votes cast. That is precisely 0.00003%. But undeterred, he aims a little bit lower this time, but still pretty high, running for governor of Virginia in 1965, where he wins 1%, finishing last. Now it's back to his advertising prowess, and to this end he embarks on some wild misadventures. He and his organization published several magazines and periodicals under such titles as, quote, Stormtrooper magazine and National Socialist World, edited by the virulent racist William Luther Pierce, later the leader of the Nationalist Alliance and author of the infamous Turner Diaries. And then there's a comic book series called, quote, Here Comes White Man, where our porcelain-skinned hero takes on all of the, quote, undesirables. So the creativity of this guy he blows me away. And last but not least is a record label called Hate-N-Any Records. You get it? Some of the audience will, some won't. It's a play on words of hootenanny, which basically is a southern term for just getting together, playing the banjo, drinking a few beers, having fun. But Hate-N-Any Records featured such balladeering luminaries as the, quote, Coon Hunters and Otis Cochran and the Three Bigots. Well, following these predictable failures, it's time to buy your ticket and ride the Hate Bus, which was Rockwell's parody of the Freedom Riders, then active in the Jim Crow South. But you won't find Rosa Parks riding in the front or back of this coach, just a bunch of lonely and displaced Nazis in a caravan of hate, festooned with swastikas and other white power symbols, raising a ruckus as they traveled from town to town. At around this time, and we're talking the mid-60s still, I think it's important to mention here something that might surprise many and infuriate some, and that's the strange bedfellows that were sometimes formed between Rockwell's white power group and the most militant factions of the Black Power movement that coexisted at the time. These types of unlikely alliances between the most extreme fringe groups of the racial divide were not new then, and they are not unknown today. Though it's not my role on this show to pontificate on these seemingly counterintuitive connections, I think it's very relevant to telling the story of Rockwell and his albeit small role in the racial strife of the day. We have to remember that groups that diametrically opposed each other, usually on the issues of race, were united in their belief in the superiority of their own, be it white, black, or any other ethnic affiliation. Like Rockwell, black militants at their core were and are racists and separatists, and they often view integration and assimilation as the greatest enemy of them all. To better illustrate this point, let's take a quick look at Rockwell's unholy alliance with Elijah Muhammad, the founder and leader of the Nation of Islam. And a quick plug here, an entire episode on him will be released shortly on our companion show, Lost and Unfound, so check that out to learn more about him if you're so inclined. He, being Rockwell, wrote to his followers, quote, Muhammad knows that mixing is a Jewish fraud and leads only to aggravation of the problems that is supposed to solve. I have talked to the Muslim leaders, and I am certain that a workable plan for separation of the races could be effected to the satisfaction of all concerned, except, that is, to the communist Jew agitators. Similar sentiments were and are expressed by not only Elijah Muhammad, but the young Malcolm X, Louis Farrakhan, David Duke, and countless others to this day. Rockwell went on to say that, quote, I am fully in concert with their program, and I have the highest respect for Elijah Muhammad. And he referred to him fawningly as, quote, the black people's Hitler. He would even go on to speak at Nation of Islam events, including one in Washington where he addressed 12,000 members and was greeted with applause. Well, despite finding an unlikely audience with those he made a career of mocking and threatening, his radical views would predictably cost him his life, but not by the hands of whom you might suspect. He was shot and killed on August 25th, 1967, by one of his own, inside a laundromat near his self-proclaimed stormtrooper barracks in Arlington. His father, upon learning of the circumstances of his son's death, remarked, quote, "I am not surprised at all. I've expected it for quite some time." The shooter was a former American Nazi member named John Patsalos, who went by the name John Patler in homage to the Führer. He had been expelled by the group shortly before, being accused of Bolshevik leanings. Patler, or Patsalos, was sentenced to 20 years, but he served 8 before being sent back to the big house again for another 6 years for various parole violations. During his time behind bars, he lamented his involvement with Rockwell, saying that, quote, "I should have been with Dr. King and the civil rights people back then. They were truly my people, not those Nazis." He remains alive today in obscurity as of this recording.
This concludes the latest episode of Well Hung History. Run away and cry now, but before you do, make sure to subscribe and leave us a killer review. Find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all the rest. New episodes drop regularly. Tom Payne Productions, all rights reserved and preserved.